Hello, I'm Manawoltos, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about why I am in favor of the death penalty. And I'd also like to qualify exactly what I mean by being in favor of the death penalty, because I'm not in favor of the death penalty necessarily for every circumstance, okay? I'm not some guy that says you commit the tiniest misdemeanor or traffic offense, immediately we're chopping your head off. I'm not that guy, okay? Let me be very clear on that in case anybody gets a misapprehension as to what I am saying. Now, I think there's a number of different cases people like to make for the death penalty. One is the prevention of repeat offenders. Another one would be as a deterrent. And the third one would be an emotional argument, uh, or a sort of ethical argument, an argument from the severity of the crime, that the crime is so severe and such an abomination that it necessitates the death penalty. So those are three arguments a lot of people like to make for the death penalty. And while I don't like using the third argument because it seems a bit too arbitrary as to who gets to decide this and that, I don't on the argument of preventing repeat offenders. I do agree that it is an effective way to prevent repeat offenders by essentially making it impossible for them to reoffend. And I also agree that the death penalty is a very strong deterrent. If you know that if you're doing something and that if you get caught doing it, you're going to get killed, that's obviously going to make you think twice about doing it. Now, that being said, again, that does not necessarily mean that I would apply the death penalty for every offense. We have to define exactly, because remember, I threw out this idea of arguing from severity or from emotion. So then the question becomes, what is a severe enough crime to merit the death penalty? So I take a sort of a pragmatic and realistic stance on this. And what do I mean by this? Well, I'm not, and people know that I'm very religious, I'm not a theocrat, okay? And I'm also not a theonomist. So what it means is that while I agree from a standpoint that these religious principles are true, I do not think that they are necessarily meant for our current society. And in doing that, I also have to be very careful to imply or to actually make it very clear that when I say they're not meant for the current society, I'm not saying that they're untrue. I'm not saying that they're immoral. And I'm not saying that they ever were immoral. Okay, so I'm trying to make that very clear. Now, we can get into arguments because as a Christian, I'm obviously referring to the Old Testament here. We can get into the argument on the difference between ceremonial law and criminal law, and differences in how criminal law should be administered. And while I say that, while I'm while the letter of the law is something that I don't think is meant for our current society, I think there are certain underlying principles that I think do apply. Because as a realist, believing these things to be true, it necessitates that they are components of the real world, which means that to deny them would, in essence, be very inconsistent on my standpoint. But anyway, getting back into it, what is the realistic and pragmatic argument here for which crimes should be considered worthy of the death penalty? So, in my system, Koinonism, which is the context in which I established the death penalty, to be very clear, And although I will argue that this should in theory be true about any society, and you can tell that this is true in the sense that most of the things that I consider, or in fact all of the things that I consider worthy of a death penalty, are at least considered crimes in most countries. So, for example, illegal forgery of currency, taking bribes, um, and various forms of corruption, people committing high crimes and misdemeanors, perjury on a high level, treason, insurrection. Those are all things that people generally agree are bad, not necessarily in a moral sense, but in a pragmatic sense when you're trying to run a country. Now, I think that that does translate to a moral sense ultimately, but I will say that when it concerns a pragmatic sense, why are these things bad? Why is it bad to have these things? Well, obviously, again, I said I'm religious, so my morals ultimately come from a theological standpoint. But when we're getting into the lower level, the pragmatic level on what a government should do, the first obvious thing that a government should do is to continue its own existence. Because without its own existence, all the other goals of a government are void. And without its own existence, the system of justice that the government establishes for its subjects is also void. And therefore, it is necessary for a government, before anything else, to continue its own existence. That necessarily means that any threats to the government's continued existence will necessarily have to be considered crimes. So, for example, treason um, and insurrection are considered crimes. Why are they considered crimes? Because they undermine the government, and the government is what establishes the system of justice, the functional and pragmatic system of justice in a society, and therefore, in essence, the government is the safeguarder for the rights of the people in a society. And therefore, by undermining the government and by undermining the system of justice, what ultimately happens is that you end up destroying something that is a benefit to all the people. Now, you can argue that in certain countries that might not be true. In certain countries might be very unjust in an absolute sense. But I will say that all of these things necessarily have to be viewed not only from a perspective of the people, which is the natural perspective that most people have, because most people aren't in power, and they should also be viewed, of course, from an absolute moral framework. So in Christianity, that would be, what does God say? But it's important to also view it from a framework, a pragmatic and realistic framework of the government and what preserves the government and what is the government doing. Now, that being said, so why the death penalty then? Why not imprison people and just keep them imprisoned or rehabilitate them eventually? Well, obviously, one problem here is what I call the Gandhi problem. Now, a lot of people love Gandhi a lot, but I don't. Okay, I love him a bit. Okay, because he's a fellow human being. I think he had some good virtues here and there, but I think there's some problems with the way he did things that I do not approve of. For example, his leading of massive civil disobedience campaigns. And you might realize at this point, if you're thinking things towards their logical conclusion, that civil disobedience, in essence, can be equally destructive to a government as is violent insurrection. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is if you're not willing to escalate as a law enforcement, as someone involved in law enforcement, when somebody's breaking the law, in order to not only arrest them, but getting as many of the perpetrators as possible, if you're not willing to escalate, then ultimately you come to a standpoint where your law becomes undone because so many people are breaking it that you actually don't have the resources to deal with the number of people breaking it, or you don't have the willingness to commit the necessary resources to deal with that. And then what happens is your country essentially becomes destroyed and restructured. And therefore, the government has failed in its primary task to secure its own continued existence. And that is a failure not only of the government to itself, but a failure upon all who rely upon the government's system of justice. And it is also, therefore, a failure in a theological sense to God, who has established the government to do such things. So, that being said, how do you prevent this? Well, you have to be able to escalate. Now, what this ultimately means is that the death penalty, or at least the use of lethal force, is the beginning and the end of all law enforcement. Now, what I'm not saying is that people should immediately shoot someone when someone commits a minor traffic offense. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that when someone commits a minor traffic offense, for a law to be established and enduring, it necessarily implies that if the person refuses to comply, and that therefore the expansion, that there's an escalation resulting from a minor traffic offense, and a person refuses to comply, that resulting escalation needs to be able to proceed all the way toward the potential of destruction of one party, which is lethal force. Because otherwise, people can simply resist and resist and resist and resist, and then your law is gone. And that's not something you want to have happen if you are trying to establish a country that endures. So therefore, one problem that proceeds from this is mass civil disobedience, where, let's say, you can't arrest everyone. The prisons are full. The jails are full. There's too many people being arrested, and you can't deal with it anymore because people are purposefully committing crimes in order to clog up your legal system. So what you have to do at that point is you need to unclog your legal system. Well, how do you unclog a legal system when you have a potentially infinite space allocated to, let's say, sending people to prison? That doesn't actually exist. That's not practical. So what you have to do is you have to eliminate them in a more pragmatic sense. And therefore, what that means is you detain them, of course, until they go to trial and etc. But the necessary punishment at that point for having committed an act of insurrection. The necessary punishment is death, because if it is not death, then people can simply engage in organized mass crime and destroy the government. Because what happens then is that the prisons get too full, and you no longer have the resources to actually punish people for committing crimes, or it goes so far that then not only are the prisons full, but then they go in and they break into the prisons and they free the criminals to help them commit more crimes. So therefore, it becomes necessary at some point to say that the death penalty needs to be on the table, because if it's not, it actually offers an easy weakness, an easy point to attack that can destroy your country. Now, I will say that such an event, while it is possible, and I think Gandhi proved very much that it is possible, is not frequent. So obviously, I don't think that the death penalty is necessary in all circumstances. What I'm most concerned about is events in which the country is at threat as a whole. Because, for example, in a conversation, in a discussion that I had that was broadcasted with Stephen Ignoramus and Karl Emmerich, Stephen Ignoramus being the host, Karl Emmerich being a progressive, he questioned me on the question of putting to death, let's say, a young man who may have illegally forged currency. Because I said that illegal forgery of currency is something that, under my system, would be a death penalty offense. So the argument that I made right out of the gate was that this is something that is destroying the country, and it's also something that is not done as a crime of passion. Nobody goes in and reconfigures a printer to make a reasonably passable copy of official currency out of just an impulse in their mind. So it's not as if you get really angry and you kill someone and then people can argue that there's rehabilitation. It's something that is definitely premeditated. And it also is something that destroys the country. And you might say, well, how does that destroy the country if one person's printing money? Well, the way it destroys the country is that any country that operates on a system where the government uses currency needs to have a monetary policy that it is in control of. Now, if an outside and unauthorized source starts messing around with the money supply, what happens is that the value of your currency is no longer stabilized by the monetary policies. And what happens then is that the government's budget could go really wild and wacky, and you might end up in a situation where the country collapses because the government's finances break. Now, you might say it's maybe excessive to say that a single person printing a small amount of money could cause this, but I say that if we're going to, let's say, execute someone that does this on a large scale, I think it's fair to apply an equal penalty on the same person committing the same crime, but on a smaller scale. Because it does the same damage, but on a smaller scale. And again, as I said, in Koinonism, the government is elected by the people. So in essence, it is not only an attack against the government and its legal system, but it's also a direct attack against every citizen by illegally forging currency. And by being a direct attack against every single citizen, I think it's actually quite merciful to put them to death, because you could argue, and I'm not going to argue this, but people might argue that they should be punished by every single citizen. And how would you do that? Well, hypothetically, in a, let's say, corporal punishment were on the table, and it's not on the table. I'm actually not in favor of that. But if you had corporal punishment and, let's say, whipping, you say one lash for every citizen. And obviously, in a large country, in a country of any reasonable size, nobody would survive that. So it would be a very brutal and a very painful way to go. And so I don't think that it's something that I approve of. So I'm in favor of a swift death. Very swift. Now, the other argument that was counter to my argument was saying, well, what about innocent people? Well, what about innocent people? If we are sentencing someone to death, the implication of sentencing them is that they are not innocent. Now, people will argue, well, what about people that are found innocent after the fact? Well, the question I would have is, under what standards were they declared guilty in the first place? Because obviously, I think entrapment is something that I do not approve of, something that I would certainly be in favor of criminalizing in every jurisdiction. Also, the idea of false confessions is something that should be criminalized in every jurisdiction. So, what the standard of law enforcement is in Koinonism is that it relies on establishing the facts of the case. In other words, you need to actually have evidence that the crime was committed. Now, that evidence could be witnesses, in personal witnesses. It could also be material witnesses, forensics. So, but the evidence needs to be put out so that it is in the view of the court that it is a fact that whatever the crime was committed. Now, obviously, I also include in the definitions of crimes, except for crimes relating to negligence, that it needs to be something that is done knowingly and willingly. So that means that if you're going out and printing money, let's say somebody tricks you and you help someone assemble and configure a printing machine, but you don't actually know what it's for, and then the government says, well, this person committed this big crime of illegal forgery of currency, and we're going to investigate you, and they found, and there's no evidence that you actually knew that you were manufacturing a device used to do that. Therefore, you would not have committed a crime in that sense. Or if under some other circumstance you could acquit yourself when there's no evidence that indicates that you knew what you were doing and or were willing to do. In other words, if somebody makes you commit something under duress, that would be illegal, obviously, the duress itself, but also you would not have the culpability that someone would have who did not do it under duress and did it willingly. So, obviously, if somebody is forced under duress to do something, that's not going to be a crime. Now, that being said, therefore, I have standards of evidence that are very high, in fact, so high that some people might even argue that they're too high and that very many guilty people will go free. So, in that sense, by having such high standards of evidence, I am convinced that very few people, if any, that actually are convicted will actually be individuals who are innocent of a crime. Now, that being said, you might say, well, what if you later found out that there is actually someone that was innocent that was still put to death? Does that then cast a moral shadow on that? So that then gets into out of a question of pragmatics and into a question of ethics. Out of a question of is the government running efficiently, and into a question of is it right that someone was falsely convicted. Now, that being said, if it is found that the court or that the court acted in a way that it should not have acted and that it therefore was compromised in some way, then obviously the court would be punished. Or if there was someone who was witnessing falsely and committed perjury, that person should be punished, and perhaps some restitution given to the inheritor of the deceased party. Now, that being said, getting back to the moral question, would that be morally okay? And this is when I go back to what I say earlier, going back to the religious question. Because again, as I had said, that as a religious person and a realist, in other words, I believe that these metaphysical and spiritual statements are things that are real, I necessarily have to include them in my calculation of the worldview. So that being said, when we go to the question of is that a sufficient standard of justice that if anybody is falsely convicted, that it would still be okay? Not okay in the sense that in an absolute sense that obviously it's a big tragedy, but okay in the sense that the government didn't do anything wrong in that. Well, I have to go to my standard of justice. And where do I get my standard of justice from in the first place? Well, I get it from God. Okay? So what God says is that people can be declared guilty under 2 or more witnesses. Now, what that means is that that is the baseline standard of justice that God himself has established, that he established it for the people of Israel, who at the time were also required to be very, very holy and therefore very pure by various laws, to the degree that they should be, in theory, acceptable to God. Now, spoiler alert, they weren't, but the essence is that this is the standard of justice that God gives to people who are not omniscient like he is. So obviously I'm not omniscient. I don't believe that the state is omniscient or could be omniscient, or at least should be omniscient. I don't think that the state necessarily should be omniscient. So I'm not in favor of mass espionage so that we can get the play-by-play on who murdered who exactly in every single square centimeter of a country as cameras watching. I'm not interested in that. I think that's excessive. But if that's the standard of justice, then anybody who is falsely convicted under that standard of justice is not convicted unjustly. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that obviously there is an injustice in the sense that the person that was convicted did not actually commit the crime, but it is not an injustice because the court used the correct and ordained standards of justice and used them in the way that they should have been used. Therefore, it is not an injustice if someone should die in this way because it is sanctioned by God himself. Now, that being said, when I say a standard of justice where things have to be established as fact, therefore there needs to be evidence, and we're going to have a presumption of innocence and all that, when I say that, I'm essentially following that standard of justice, and I'm actually, the way I think about it, it probably is even stricter than that in some sense. So when someone asks me, well, what if 100 people die innocently? What if 1,000 people die? What if 300 million innocents die under your system of justice that follows all these standards of evidence? Is that still just? The answer I have is that my God says that it is. And therefore, God being the origin and the justification of all logic, reason, and all consistency in the universe, in a somewhat Platonic sense, you might say, I have to necessarily say that it is just, and that therefore it doesn't actually matter how many innocent people die under this system, because it is the same standards, and I would argue perhaps even stricter than the standards established by God himself, who is just a priori by definition. So, in that sense, I don't think there's any problem with implementing the death penalty in that way. And in fact, the fact that I don't put a death penalty on every crime is a loosening, you might say, of justice, because in God's system of ultimate justice, every crime has the death penalty. Now, obviously not in the system that he applied to Israel, where there's room for restitution, which is something that I like implementing very much in my system. I think that very frequently in a lot of societies, there's too big of a focus on punishing the criminal directly than there is upon actually fixing the wrong and putting a restitution, a repayment for what has been damaged. So I think the Coinonist system of justice focuses very much on restitution, and therefore there are three types of punishments for crime in Coinonism, at least on the higher levels. There might be different ones on the communal levels, and those three types are monetary restitution, where you pay a fine; labor restitution, where you work. Now, people will say, this sounds a lot like slavery, and to be honest, it kind of is, okay? But the difference here is that the person isn't actually owned, and that the person has a lot of rights in this status. I think it's very important to establish the rights of people very clearly. And so the monetary labor restitution essentially replaces the prison system, because I think incarcerating a large number of criminals together, at the one side, it helps breed criminality by essentially creating a community of criminals that interact with each other and that teach each other tricks and then form gangs, etc., which is something that I would prefer to avoid. On the other hand, I think it's a waste of labor and a waste of money. That's why I told Karl Emmerich that I thought that imprisoning people is a waste of resources, because getting people to actually work, not in these prison shops and such things, but actually do real work that is productive in a very direct sense, is something that I think is better. Now, people will say, well, what if people try to escape? What if they run away? Okay, since you're not walling them in a high security area, what if they run away? Well, simple. If they don't respect our system of justice, we kill them. There you go. Another death penalty. Because it's like it's like the statement Jordan Peterson made, where he was resisting the laws of that were being placed, and the requirements and the rules regarding treatment of LGBT people. By the way, I'm not a massive fan of Jordan Peterson. Just so you know, I like some of the things he says. I don't like some other things he says. He's got a sort of a neutral position on that. But Jordan Peterson said that he would resist, and that if they try to pressure him, he would prefer to go to prison, and if they sent him to prison, then he would go on a hunger strike, etc. And he would essentially resist to the ultimate sense that he would die. So there's a lot of people, although not the majority of people, but there are a lot of people who have that mentality that they're going to follow through with what they think is right and what they think is warranted, even if it goes to the very end. So people who therefore resist the system of justice, and again, going back onto the Gandhi problem, it ultimately becomes necessary for people who resist paying a fine to then put them into work, and if they resist working, then you put them to death. It's that simple, because it comes to a point where the worst thing you can do to someone in a society ends up being just permanently putting them in solitary confinement, which I think is something that I wouldn't wish upon anyone. I don't think that it's productive economically. I don't think that it's productive socially either. So I think it's better to leave these people in the workforce, but with a large portion of what would be their pay instead going toward the restitution for the crimes that they have committed. And if they're sentenced for a certain period and for a certain amount, but the amount ends up actually being fulfilled before the period is up, then they get the extra money at the end of their sentence. I think that's fair to give them. But again, I think that when someone becomes an existential threat to the government and to the system of justice, and by extension to the entire society that is held together by the system of justice, I think it's justified for the government to then become an existential threat to that person. Now, that being said, I want to be very clear that I'm not interested in arbitrarily declaring people enemies of the state. I want to make that very clear, that everything that is criminal should be delineated and denoted very clearly in law, and have very clear applications and very clear definition of what the proper punishment is. So I'm not in favor of an arbitrary system where we just put out a law that's sort of loose and that doesn't actually define exactly what constitutes the crime specifically, such as I think it was in Minnesota they had murder free where part of the language was evincing a depraved mind. What is that supposed to mean? Who gets to define what evincing a depraved mind is? It's something that didn't make sense when I heard about it. And by the way, I'm not necessarily defending or condemning the officers involved, at least in this context here, because it's off topic. But I do want to say that that kind of language in a law is something that should be avoided at least from my perspective. And if I were to write a constitution, it's not something that I would include in that way. Or the elastic clause in the US Constitution. You shouldn't have something that simply says, and whatever is necessary, or and whoever opposes the government in any way. That's too vague. I think, therefore, it's very important to define exactly each crime so that people can know exactly which things they should not do. Now, obviously, most of these things are things that are banned in every country. So, obviously, no country tolerates treason. No country tolerates insurrection, or at least I hope they don't. Sometimes I'm getting worried about the U.S. looking at what's happening in the recent violence, and I'm thinking, well, when are they actually going to start using live rounds and shooting these people? But I can understand that a lot of people consider that type of action to be excessive, but I think it's very important to put out a very clear and distinct message that there are certain things which will not be tolerated under any circumstances, and that therefore, by committing those things, the person has essentially placed himself as an enemy of the state and all its people, and that therefore that action merits death. In a similar sense, that going to war, you kill enemy combatants while you're at war, in a similar sense to that. But in this case, it's someone in your own country for whom your country has a responsibility and who has a responsibility to your country. So that's my thoughts. Tell me what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Am I being too hard line on this issue? Am I being too soft? I'm sure there's probably some people out there that are thinking that I'm too soft. And again, I would like to emphasize that this has nothing to do with the idea of fascism. Anybody that has read the Fascist Manifesto could tell you that fascism is actually a very specific thing with very specific values. Because again, as I said, almost all countries ban these things that I talk about. So now you might also say, well, almost all countries don't have the death penalty, and I see that as a structural weakness in their countries, that if they wait long enough, probably someone will come around that will exploit it. But again, when it concerns the question, is this an authoritarian standpoint for thinking? Well, again, I would argue that if you go back to the thing I just said, most countries ban these things anyway. The question is not, should these things be banned? The question is, how harshly are we going to punish people for doing these things? And by putting people to death, I think I send a very clear message that these things are not tolerated at all, and that there will be given no quarter at all for people who commit such crimes. So there you go. Tell me what you think again. Thank you all for watching. Anawiltos over and out.